Welcome to Titubanti, Testi 11 Binomio di lettura. It is my pleasure to introduce you the two speakers of tonight, Gabriella Cianciolo, Professor of Architectural History at the University of Cologne, and John Oksanish, Professor of Classics, Latin Literature at Wake Forest. I'm so glad that we were able to organize this event around a text that I know pretty well, both because I studied with Professor Elisa Romano, whom we have the pleasure to have today with us, and also because I was considering it, for my own work. And I remember today that actually my job talk at Ghent University was on Vitruvius. So this is always a nice memory. So when I was hired at Ghent, I gave a talk on Vitruvius, which is not, people here in classics know that Vitruvius is by no means a canonical author and a little bit risky according to certain criteria to present for a job talk. So thank you so much, both of you. John is going first, and I'm going to share the screen immediately for him with his handout. And feel free to start, John. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm also got a timer for myself, so I stay relatively on task. But thank you so much, Marco, for organizing this series, and you, Gabriella, for choosing the passage and the invitation to talk about it. So my thinking today is that I would give you a little bit of speakers in the series have done a little sense of how I ended up coming to Vitruvius. And I think, Marco, as we were talking before we officially started here, this passage is I think, very interesting and timely right now in terms of the intersection of ethics and aesthetics and what they mean in political context as well. So I think it's good to think with as I guess architecture as a form of representation and the theorization of architecture as its own kind of I don't want to reduce it to a mere performance, but a way of kind of working out some thoughts and values around what we represent and how we do it. So I'll very briefly introduce myself here. I'm at Wake Forest here in North Carolina. I've been here for about 15 years, and I've tended mostly to publish on Vitruvius. I do doing a little bit of work on Cicero, and I've done some stuff on other things, but I think Vitruvius has been the through line, although things sort of slowed down with the pandemic as it did for many of us. I think it's important for me to say briefly how I got to Vitruvius in the first place, because it kind of relates to this general notion of Vitruvius as a, let's say, non-canonical author, but also to the kind of odd space that he occupies between historians of art and architecture as well as in classics. So when I did a master's degree after my bachelor's, there was a project option in which one could write a brief commentary on a passage of Latin, and I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. But one of my professors, sadly recently late Marios Philippides at UMass Amherst, he was a Byzantinist. He suggested that I take a look at Vitruvius, and I thought, I don't know who that is. I've never heard of Vitruvius. And the passage that I got interested in was the design of the theater, and particularly the notion of these echea, which, for those of you who are not familiar, there's these bronze sounding vessels that Vitruvius suggests can be placed and by some measure ought to be placed in theaters for resonance in the theater building. He sort of admits that, well, you don't really see them around Rome because our theaters are wooden and there's natural resonance there, but it got me thinking about the difference between what he stipulates in the desire for rational thinking, systematicity, also adopting maybe Hellenistic Greek models, and what the archaeological record actually preserves for us, much less whether or not the things actually work. And I know people have done attempted to do studies on this, and it's not always been clear. So anyway, that's a bit how I got to Vitruvius. And I think this passage that's been chosen from Book 7 connects to this in the sense that people who read the passage, Vitruvius sort of sometimes been called a screed against surrealism in wall painting, has sometimes been seen as example of how out of touch Vitruvius was with contemporary practice, right? So interested in his notion of, let's say, conservatism, perhaps the earlier masonry style wall paintings, which he seems to like and talks about in the previous passage here, and also talks about landscapes and demonstrating the wanderings of Ulysses, Pertopia. I think it's quite nice that he uses the Greek term for that, as well as stories from the Iliad. So he says those things were okay, we liked that, but now people are doing all of these sort of strange things, and that's what the passage talks about. Essentially, they appear to be architecturally unfeasible representations. So as he goes on to talk about, how can a reed or a stock hold up a candelabrum or support an architrave, right? So there's the kind of notion of impossibility that it appears to be what bothers him about that. But I think that underlying that, there are other issues, and this connects, I think, to what I see as one of the main, and I'm hardly alone in this, the main foci of the work overall. So I'll draw your attention to the handout there. This is what we start with, a passage from Suetonius, where Suetonius talks about Augustus's architectural achievements, noting that he so improved the city, which had not been decorated in accordance with the empire's greatness, neque pro majestate imperii ornatam. And I think the thing that I find interesting there is the idea of majestas, and I'm going to come back to that. This is the one area of this paper that will not merely sort of synthesize the kind of thinking I've done on this in the past, but will try to nudge the conversation forward a little bit, and I'd really be interested to see what other folks have to say. So there's a sort of lack of proportionality that Augustus recognized between the city as it was in terms of its building. And this is something that he sought to redress, and he, in fact, did so, not only for us, such as we can determine it now after all the subsequent layers of Roman architecture, but the language, I think, is very important. Tutam etiam, this is in that second chunk there of the Suetonius, tutam etiam in posterum praestitit, tutam etiam in posterum praestitit. So the idea being there that that the text repeats itself, or rather I repeated the text there, but the idea being that Augustus wishes to successfully transmit that city to posterity. And that's a notion that Vitruvius himself in the preface, and that's the second passage, had talked about. You notice that he uses in the Latin there the word majestas, in fact the collocation majestas imperii. He says, "O Augustus, I noticed that you had concern for the majestas of the imperium, and that that you wanted to have the auctoritates, using the plural, that would correspond with that notion of correspondence and proportionality returns in the excerpt 1 preface 3 there, pro amplitudine rerum gestarum ut postris memoriae tradurentur." So that collocation, that idea of handing things down to posterity in proportion, I think is kind of a leitmotif among several throughout the Architectura. And the idea posteris memorias tradere and the like is a kind of shorthand that the Roman historiographers would use for writing history. So there's a way in which I think that a good chunk of the Architectura is motivated by its capacity to make and create history, and this is something that Professor Romano has talked about in other contexts, the idea of Vitruvius as being a kind of historian. So that sort of lays the groundwork a little bit. To the passage itself, and if you want, Marco, you could scroll down just a little bit. I would, I've sort of summarized it a little bit previously, but what I would want to note here is that Vitruvius, in talking about wall paintings, and here again, we're probably talking about domestic interiors rather than public buildings. So that's a distinction that we might make, given his emphasis in the preface, when it comes to what architecture and its principles should do. But I do think that to some extent, much of what we see in De Architectura, even the representations of private interiors do correspond, or at least respond to the general notion of what is appropriate. And I think that's one reason where, and this is perhaps something Gabriella will talk about, where this passage has been confusing to some folks, because if it corresponds, if what he describes corresponds to what Mao identified as, let's say, the late second or early third styles, these are the kinds of things that might have been, that we believe were prevalent even in sort of the Augustan household and the Augustan circle. So it would seem that Vitruvius is being so conservative in his approach that it does not cohere with what the princeps and his family were doing in many cases. So I think one thing that I would just point out here, if you look at the passage, is this idea, again, of a kind of disproportionality. The proportionality now is between what can and cannot exist, what cannot and cannot be made. In that first sentence, pro columnis enim struuntur calami striati. So the idea that instead of columns, right, you have these reeds. So what is depicted in the painting is a structural impossibility. So that is the falsehood that chafes against what Vitruvius, his own principles are. And I think those principles are very much connected to the idea of truth. People have talked about this from a kind of Stoic perspective, right? The idea that in Stoic philosophy, the idea of truth and ratio was to motivate one's perceptions, and there are ideas here that go back to Plato in terms of the idea that art has the potential to deceive and to lead one psyche, a soul, astray by the mere act of representation. Vitruvius seems to take this idea and move with it, and reject it when it comes to the artistic depictions of architectural realities, what we might call physics. If you could scroll down, Marco, to the next half of this passage, there's something. I just want to keep track of time here. Yes, I think we get into some of the language of truth and falsity that I find very interesting, and also the language of judgment. So Vitruvius says, such things cannot be brought to pass. This is my translation in the end. And never could. And I would even revise my translation here to say not so much be brought to pass, but cannot be made. Again, with the emphasis on construction of a building. And I sometimes wonder in this passage, or I have when rereading it and rethinking about it for this, whether Vitruvius was not only being asked to supervise frescoes that depicted these things, but whether in fact people who looked for the services of the architect wanted him to be able to create the kinds of surreal structures that were depicted, which is to say, can't you make a structure with really thin columns? Maybe they weren't actual reeds, right? But that I wondered if there wasn't even a real world kind of something that his clients might see in painting and wish could be placed in the real world that he was not able to physically deliver, and he didn't want to deal with those complaints anymore. But in any case, I think that the distinction that he makes is between what can and cannot be made, what has existed, and what has not existed. And this comes in the language, as we see again in the notion of falsehood, so falsa, in the second bolded part there. And then, and I think this is extremely important, is that he directs his criticism to the those who choose and desire and enjoy these representations. And so down below there, he says, obscurata mentis, these darkened mentes, darkened minds, right? And that's this notion of darkness is a loaded word in De Architectura, because in some ways Vitruvius is the illuminator of architecture for his readership. But I think also important is that they are not strong enough to probare, to approve or make that judgment. So we have now entered the realm of judgment and authority, which goes back in many ways to the preface to the work overall. And I think something that Vitruvius himself, when he designs the ideal architect, right, he famously, for those of us who know the text well, he says that what the architect does is he gathers all of these other arts so that he can judge and approve, judicare and probare, even the products of other arts. Okay, so if you could scroll down a little bit more, Marco, there, and I wanted to show an example. I imagine, Gabriella, you may have some too, but this is from the Black Room at Bosco Trecase. It's in the Met in New York. So if you wanted to see an example of, in fact, the style on frescoes, I mean, these are so visually erotic, but they also suggest kind of structural and architectural impossibility. It's not precisely what he describes, but you can certainly see the overlap compared with earlier styles, which represented, as it were, the real structural world and imitated surfaces of, let's say, masonry, to take the most basic representative of trompe l'oeil as an example. And then if you could scroll down a little bit more, Marco, I wanted to show a kind of transition a bit here. And this is something that I had talked about in my book, and others have as well. And that is the role of rhetoric in Vitruvius's description. So at a certain point, particularly 20 or 30 years ago, people started to look at the passage about wall paintings in Vitruvius' Screed and say that, well, we don't have to necessarily say that he's actually conservative or backward. I mean, this is one of those places where people who don't like Vitruvius like to talk about how out of touch with current practice he was, suggestions of his ignorance, and that feeds into a long reception tradition of Vitruvian expertise. But one of the ways in which the background in rhetoric for Vitruvius shows up is in his use of theoretical terminology, but also in his use of what I would call truth categories. So in handbooks of rhetoric, such as the De Inventione of Cicero, and then the anonymous Rhetorica ad Arrhenium, the descriptions of narratio, which is to say the narratives that you would offer in your speech in court, could take really one of three options in terms of their truth content. You could tell historia, which is something that was actually done to demonstrate your narrative and convince the other judices, the jury. You could tell a fabula, which would be something that is not true, nec verae nec veri similes. So now we're getting again to the language of truth and falsehood. And then finally that of argumentum, which is something in the middle, so something made up but which could have happened. Ficta res quae tamen fieri potuit. And what I found very interesting about that is, in a rhetorical context, what you allow is an argumentum. You allow a certain amount of falsity as long as it's plausible. But that idea of quae fieri potuit, the thing that's made up but that could be done, sort of connects interestingly with what Vitruvius says are the current practices in wall paintings that he decries, because what he dislikes in that case are things that cannot be described. So he says that, you know, those kinds of things simply cannot be, and therefore we will not allow them, these sort of, you know, monstrosities and physical impossibilities, these adunata, whereas in rhetoric that is allowed. So we have kind of two columns, sort of natural and rational truth value, and on the other, rhetorical, persuasive truth value. If you go ahead, Marco, to the next slide, we have what I think is a very interesting example of how these kind of two areas of truth value tend to come into, let's say, conflict with each other potentially. So these are the, we call them now caryatids, very likely after Vitruvian influence, that would have been in the Attic story of the portico of the Forum of Augustus. Vitruvius talks early on in book 1, when he's talking about the education of the ideal architect and how he should know history. He gives an example of the caryatids. He said, you know, if you want to, and you can just kind of barely see the text there at the bottom, if someone, thank you, if someone has placed marble statues, sort of women wearing stolas, which are called caryatids, in place of columns, pro columnis. Again, we have that, it's in some ways coincidental, but it is useful for our persuasive goals. If someone wants to put them there, he can explain why through the use of history and the use of an argumentum. So he says this is totally okay for someone to use statues of women in the place of columns. But what I find interesting about this is this, of course, this is not a painting, and so what is represented is not the same kind of architectural representational impossibility. At the same time, what we do have represented in the structure is we have the representation of a woman holding up a structure, right? So he has made an allowance in the case of caryatids, at least structural caryatids in actual building, that would suggest a kind of impossibility, but an allowance is made for it, perhaps because of the historical value, which he goes on to delineate earlier in the treatise, of the story of how the caryatids as an architectural feature came to be, and this has to do with their treachery, essentially, at least as he describes it. Okay, so that's laying out some of my thoughts on different kinds of truth value in Vitruvius, how it appears in the passage on frescoes. To wrap up, I'd like to talk about another rhetorical text. So yeah, you can go down to that last page there, Marco. Thank you so much. About truth value and majestas in another sense. So I've been doing a little bit of work, as I mentioned, on De Inventione, and I started writing a paper on the Constitutio Definitiva, or in the later rhetorical tradition, just definitio or finitio. The idea being that in your speech, right, in court, one of the kinds of arguments that you could make is an argument from definition, and it is described by Cicero, the youngish Cicero, as when there is a question of a word, a nomen, it's called a definitional issue because the meaning of a term must be limited by words. And what's interesting to me about this is that in De Inventione and in the Rhetorica ad Herennium and in the later tradition, the theoretical discussions of definitio very often are connected with majestas, right? And so now we're talking about majestas, the charge of something like treason, or I guess in the we would use the term lese majesty, and that is again, as in a argument from definition, someone has diminished majestas when they take away essentially the quality which provides the amplitudo for the civitas or the citizenry. I mean, it's differently described in the different texts, but essentially that's the idea, that the majestas, the greatness, however we want to call it, despite any questions about etymology, when that is reduced, that is maestas. So we have a sense of diminishment of this essential quality, which ought to represent Rome in one way or another. In these earlier examples, they actually tend to be from the early Republic. But what I think is particularly interesting about this, and this is what I'll wrap up with, are the arguments for both the prosecution and the defense when it comes to maestas in the definitional issue. It's all about meaning and who gets to decide, assign meaning. So the prosecution might say in the examples that if the other side is trying to say that they have not committed maestas and they're trying to define it differently, that they have not only sort of tried to arrogate or disrupt the things themselves, the res, but also the things that represent them, the verba. And it's more or less the same from the other side. So the charge of maestas, when it comes up in these early rhetorical texts, is often associated with the idea of definition, which itself is attempts to limit rhetorically, right, in rhetoric, the relationship between the thing that represents, that's to say, in that case, the verbum, and the thing that is represented, which is what in this case, maestas. So what I find compelling and interesting about that is, if we think back, and if you like, Marco, you can scroll back up to the second half of the passage from Book 7. That's good, right there. Is that this is precisely what Vitruvius is doing here, right? In that he's bringing in the language of judgment and approval of essentially forensic circumstance around the notion of definition. And when that relationship is thought to break down, I think I mean, for Vitruvius, all sorts of categories will fall out of whack. But ultimately, if we think about this in the Augustan context, auctoritas and the proportional relationship between buildings and what they represent, that diminishes. And so, again, I think in an Augustan context, politically, that would present, I won't say would present problems for Augustus, but certainly it would present Vitruvius in a very different light than how we receive him. And it probably helps us to contextualize a little bit more some of his commitments to the relationship between what can and cannot be represented in different media at different times. So thank you for listening, and that's what I've got to say to you.
Thank you so much, John. This was truly splendid. Also because, I mean, you gave the context, and let me say that this is precisely what I normally expect within Titubanti Testi, that there is one more related to the historical and cultural context, and this was your job, let's say. But now we are also very interested and eager to know what Gabriella, who was the one, just to remind you, that who proposed the text, has to tell us. For classicists, she's coming from a completely different background. So thank you so much, John. And Gabriella, you feel free to share also the screen.
Yes, I try. 1 second. Window. Do you see it now? Can you see?
Yes, we can.
So thank you very much. I don't see you, so it's a bit weird. I just see my screen. But I briefly introduce myself. I am, as Marco said, an architectural historian. I'm very thankful and very happy to be part of this series. Thank you, Marco, for the invitation, and thank you, John, for this wonderful reading, giving the context I was missing. and I will explain a little bit how we, from the point of view of architectural history, and specifically in the 19th century, what happens to this specific passage by Vitruvius, how differently it was interpreted and received. So it's about Vitruvius, but also about Roman wall paintings in general and 19th century iron architecture. That's how I came across Vitruvius and this passage. This passage that I don't need to explain again because John did it already wonderfully, that just it's a criticism against this decorative practice in Roman wall painting, because it diverged from rational thinking, truth, or structural reality. And this is exactly what now my reading has in common with John's reading. That's what can and cannot be made. That's exactly the point. And now I come to, so we all know that in Pompeii there are hundreds, maybe now many of them completely disappeared, some of them in Naples Museum. This is a new discovery just a few months ago in Pompeii, this wonderful blue room. And this is the structure that already John showed. This is the structure that Vitruvius is interested in and criticizes. There is, like in Pompeii, many different kind of paintings, figurative paintings, architectural paintings, and this is the second style, which is more realistic. As you can see, the proportions are realistic. The figure compared to the columns, capitals, this is possible. And this is impossible. This is what disappoints or irritates Vitruvius, what he condemns: fantastical, irrational, hybrid, ornamental details which are misleading. And he says elegance alone is not enough for him. But interestingly enough, in many different epochs, in the antiquity, because we have so many of these paintings, so they were en vogue. And then in the Renaissance, again, a lot of grotesque and this kind of representation everywhere in interiors. And again in the 19th century. So basically, this criticism, he must have been frustrated because his criticism was and he's also criticizing the people appreciating this kind of impossible structures. So within this project, I just explained, I was working about from Pompeii from an interdisciplinary point of view with physicists, restorers, art historian, architectural historian. And I was just doing a lot of archival research, and I was finding so many of such drawings, wonderful watercolors by architects representing exactly these paintings in Pompeii or in Naples or in Herculaneum. And I was wondering, why were architects so obsessed, so impressed with these paintings? I was asking myself, is it about color, or what is their fashion? Why are the architects, really, I found hundreds of them, and architects were more interested in these fantasies than in real Pompeian houses, structures. So I was curious, and I started to investigate. And then the architect who gave me the intuition of these possible interpretation was Henri Labrouste. These are drawings by Labrouste, watercolors by Labrouste. And this is him. And this is one of his masterpieces, the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris. And this is the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Both wonderful spaces with slender columns in iron that Labrouste designed. And so, and of course, there is something Pompeian here, especially, for example, in these garden paintings in the wall. So the connection with Pompeii is already clear. So my idea was, what about the idea that actually Labrouste was imagining to see here iron structures? And I started investigating, and I cannot, of course, tell you all the development of the research, but finally I found the evidence that actually this is what the architects were interested in. So during the Industrial Revolution, thanks to the new possibility afforded by iron as a building material, such imaginary impossible structure became possible. And so a material transfer happened from painted surfaces to three-dimensional structures. So this abstraction, these surrealistic paintings began to find their way into standardized modular iron structures. So from two-dimensional paintings to three-dimensional real iron structures. And this is why Pompeian frescoes suddenly were so popular, and so many architects were curious about them and were so fascinated. So because the iron was a problem, was a challenge, was not only a new material with endless possibilities. There is a famous art historian who called, Barry Bergdahl, who called the discovery of, or the use of iron, the iron problem. Because imagine the columns on the left, Doric, Ionic, in iron, of course impossible. So the architects needed a completely new aesthetics, a new style, iron style. And Pompeian frescoes offered precisely the solution for this problem, for this challenge. And it was a practical solution, but also with the authority of antiquity. So it was the perfect solution. So this extravagant architectural structure provided a perfect model for the new constructional purposes of the time. And so re-emerged in the form of slender, very thin columns in iron. And when I was in London working in this archive, Royal Institute of British Architects, and first I found the drawing on the left, where this is a Pompeian room, or a room in Pompeian style. And the column with this shadow is clearly going out of the wall. So it's becoming three-dimensional. So I was completely fascinated, because I said, okay, this is exactly the process I imagine, or the architects were imagining. And then I found by the same author, the article saying exactly this, the effects which should result to architectural taste with regard to arrangement and design from the general introduction of iron. They can build Pompeian impossible structures. And then from a little article with an hypothesis, I could write an entire book about it, because I found many other projects and a lot of evidence, both textual and also design. And there was this connection, which was completely invisible. Like there was no connection between iron architecture, or the history of iron architecture in the 19th century, and Pompeii and these paintings. So what Vitruvius criticizes precisely what enjoyed great success in the 19th century. But then back to Vitruvius and the arabesque. I don't go into the concept of the arabesque because it's very complex, but to explain why all these authors say arabesque, but they refer to murals, to Roman wall paintings. They were called arabesque. And this is Goethe, for example, writing about von Arabesken, or here Quatremer de Quincy, saying that these paintings are so generally used in Pompeii that this city can be seen as a painted city, and the taste is called today arabesque, être contre against was Vitruvius. And there is a lot of, like, this is a topos repeating everywhere. Vitruvius was entirely out of conceit with this sort of ornament and declares that such fanciful paintings are not founded in truth and cannot be beautiful. But the general voice, both in ancient and modern times, has pronounced a different opinion. That's funny that already this authority was questioned. And now what I was in, I'm not a Latinist, so my approach was just the reception, so from the perspective of the 19th century, but it's interesting that he used specific terms. For example, monsters, iniquis, so a moral judgment, something that he sees as monsters, and this arpaginetuli, apagineculi, this is a very controversial term. It's a volute or something similar. And then this candelabra, which is one of the Pompeian styles. And it's all about possibility, impossibility, absurdity, amorality. This hybrid form did not correspond to natural standard, so did not obey to physical or statical laws. But anyway, they had a lot of success. So we have first Vitruvius creating the bias, the prejudice. Then we have the intellectual reproducing the bias all the time. Goethe, Quatremère de Quincy, they were like appreciating, but not entirely. And there is a lot of criticism about licentious, ridiculous paintings, or Serou d'Agincourt calls these paintings the first degree of decadence in ancient painting in the 5th volume of the Histoire de l'Art. So in the 19th century, there is still like a shadow on this, and this is not the only prejudice. But then the architects begin to overcome the bias and begin to question Vitruvius' authority, because they find this style wonderful. They like it, and they find a style. So they, first of all, reject Vitruvius, Plinius, and they say, with all the deference, there is another side of the question, which these great authorities seems to have overlooked. Because if we examine the arabesque independently of these prejudices, we shall find endless beauty, variety, and originality, and so on. But the interesting part is that they recognize the iron style, a style of architecture of extreme tenuity, which is the most obvious effect to be produced by the formation of a genuine style adapted to the use of cast iron without losing sight of the precedents afforded by antiquity. So they are just enthusiastic to find this, and they adopt this style, and at a certain point question this great authority. And so this is what happens, that these paintings, this is a painting from Zahn publication, wonderful chromolithographs with many details of these paintings. They imagine, and of course, it's easy to understand what they see in this painting. They see thin iron structure with wonderful decoration. They also need the decoration. They are not ready to build the Tour Eiffel in the first half of the 19th century. Ornament, decor is essential. And here they find everything. And so there is a development of a theory about this kind of architecture. This is a specific kind of architecture, which is in ancient painting and in modern iron architecture. So now, concluding, I was interested, and maybe we have a couple of minutes to discuss some of these points or other questions. So for me, the question were, what does monster mean in this context? What is this concept of monstrosity in Vitruvius and the Roman world attached to this kind of ornament? Another interesting point for me, from my point of view, also in architectural history, history of ornament, is that the target of criticism and of moral criticism from Vitruvius to Adolf Loos, and we can say even against graffiti today, is always a moral criticism against ornament. Then this shadow that Vitruvian criticism cast against these paintings that contributed to a lasting taboo and a lot of criticism until 19th century architects re-evaluate these arabesque, these paintings, showing that they were less dependent from the authority because they are not intellectual, they are architects who need to build. And they are very open to recognize the beauty, the variety of this decoration. And then the last point is the Stoffwechsel theory or metabolism theory. Gottfried Semper invented this theory that is the material transformation. And we can see this metabolism from painted surface to three-dimensional iron structure. So iron in the 19th century made the impossible structure possible. Thank you. These are my points.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabriella. This was truly splendid. And I must add on a personal note that although I know Gabriella already, I don't know, 30 years, this is the first time I was able to participate in a scholarly discussion with her. So thank you so much, Gabriella. That was really, really amazing. And this also has implications because, you know, Vitruvius is not a model, but it's an anti-model. So I think this is also fascinating, this role of the classical as an anti-model. But what happens normally, I mean, normally I give the word back to John. I mean, to the first speaker, if you would like to add something, and then I open up the discussion. We have another 13 minutes, more or less, so there is time to ask questions for both. But John, would you like to add something or say something, ask something to Gabriella?
Sure. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Gabriella. That was wonderful, and I learned so much from that. I had never known this, but what you argue for makes perfect sense to me. And I think that what it brings up for me, and I won't take a lot of time on this, is I want to hear more about this this place of material, right? Because it seems that in both the evolution of the actual sort of thin columns, right, that we get in architectural forms, that comes about as a result of material possibility. And again, back in the Vitruvian passage, where so much of the critique is around what we might call buildability, let's say, and less about the representational capacity even of painting itself. So that's something that I just want to, I guess, think a little bit more about. I have some thoughts on the monstra bit, but I will just leave that for later. I just want to thank you again for really very fascinating talk, and I can't wait to read more about this, of your work.
Thank you so much.
So, okay, you are welcome, guys. We are a small group of people. I also see Michael Goyette. Hello, Michael. I don't know, guys. Do you have any question for both speakers? And
not really a question, but just to pick up on what both of you noticed, and something that struck me when I looked at this Latin passage. Yeah, precisely this concept of monstra, and I don't have an answer to it at all, but I just think this is a key term, right? Because it has both to do with this theme of what's quod fieri potest, right? What can actually happen and what can't. Yeah, That's all. Just that I think maybe it would be interesting to think more about that. I actually don't know. Do the Latinists here have confirmation of this? But I remember being vaguely taught years ago. So we have these words in Latin literature: monstrum, portentum, a few other things. What are the differences between them? Etymologically, is monstrum in fact the same root as monstrare, like something that draws people to point to it and to show it out? I just don't know.
I have been reading something about this concept because I wanted to understand more. I don't have an answer, of course, but there was also some scholars interpreting this concept of monster in a positive way, something disruptive. So maybe not entirely negative.
That's actually
like the potential of the monstrosity is to be irregular, and everything irregular is something that can promise something new, or that was one of the different readings.
I think that's, yeah, Craig, I like your question about that, because and Gabriella, also your reminder about what monstra can be, particularly in the post-classical tradition. I think that, you know, on the Latin side, just looking at the text here, you know, he contrasts monstra with imagines, which is an interesting notion. Now, admittedly, they're ex rebus finitis imagines, and Vitruvius likes those, what do they call them? Adnominal prepositional phrases, like prepositional phrases that are almost like adjectives. So like real images is essentially what he would say. But it's interesting because it strikes me that, you know, when I think of an imago, right, and we think of imago in Latin literature, we're thinking about the mask, the funeral mask representation, right? So like, whereas it's like an imago inherently represents things, and perhaps a monstrum does not. Like maybe by definition, that is the space between an imago and a monstrum. Like there's like a mimetic failure for a monstrum. Just a thought.
I just did a really quick lexical search for monstrum, and Lewis and Short connect it with moneo, so a warning or admonition. I guess I had always assumed that it would be connected with monstro, but not according to Lewis and Short.
Okay, this is interesting. I always connected it to monstrare, so I don't know, maybe, it is a different, thank you,
Thank you. And what about these, many translation translate something depraved, depravation. So there is something like an ethical judgment, and is it normal? Like, and also it's not about hybrid figures. It's more about impossible structures. That's interesting. I could imagine criticizing some hybrid beings, half animal, half woman, which is a monstrum and maybe depraved, but not a column, to be honest.
Yeah, this is very peculiar. I was thinking all the time, of course, I mean, Ovid's Metamorphosis, who is a continuous tale of monstrosity in this sense, transformations, and also the most weird things happening. But of course, this is different because it relates to hybrids or bodies transformed into something else. But in this case, it's really about things, about objects. Why would he be so offended by,
I mean, the other place, sorry,
no.
I was just going to say briefly, the other place that people often talk about with relation to this passage, right, is the beginning of Horace's Ars Poetica, where you actually do have a hybrid creature who's, you know, part woman, part fish, kind of a, you know, almost like a Scylla type creature, and he sort of says, who wouldn't laugh? And actually, I think that Martin Nichols, when she talks about this passage in her book, she has a great line that says, like, if you laughed every time you saw a hybrid creature in Rome, your life would be very mirthful indeed. Which I think captures to some extent like how much of this is likely to be a kind of posturing, and so this we know it's just a question of disentangling.
And maybe I can add something about 19th century discussion. Many architects imagined that these painted structures were real structures which did not exist anymore. And they were imagining, for example, Hittorf, Gottfried Semper, they were bronze or wood structures, for example, on top of the buildings, which did not exist anymore. But many architects were imagining those structures as really real once existing constructions.
And is that now rejected? I mean, do people say these didn't really exist, or?
I think yes, but I'm not archaeologist, so this is also a little open question in my research. Yeah.
What's interesting sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's interesting to me too about this is that, when Vitruvius talks about, and so much of what you showed us, Gabriella, was about columns, right? But when Vitruvius talks about the evolution of column types, right, you have like the Doric, which is the most masculine, then the Ionic and the Corinthian, and both the Ionic and Corinthian symmetries and column types, they're associated with kinds of like femininity, right? But in their region of origin, and also in their proportions. And the Corinthian's an interesting one because of the capital, right, which comes up. It's like the story of that, right, is that there's a basket that's placed on these acanthus leaves, this grave of this young girl, and then this guy Callimachus discovers it. And then you get that in a column. And I think it's interesting because he mentions acanthus leaves there, unless I'm misremembering this, and yet he also suggests that acanthus leaves are some of the things that should not be represented in these fantastical things. That's more of a side note. I think in general, what I'm wondering about is that we have this kind of gradual narrowing of the column type that Vitruvius sees as a part of the evolution of architecture, but there's a certain point at which he evidently stops. And so the question is like, certainly material could be a part of that, but what else motivates that stopping, that contributes to these iniqui mores? Does it have to do more with his notion of like, venustas, firmitas, utility, like those tripartite elements? So I don't know. That just I thought of that when you're talking about the columns in particular.
This is what I think. His idea of stability of the building, and maybe also authority, like because it's an architecture, a very playful, very light. So if he's at the beginning of your talk was about majestas, authority, probably this is also the opposite in style and in taste. So probably also he was against this kind of decoration, and maybe the static reason is to justify something he just doesn't like.
Yeah, he doesn't like it because it is not realistic, of course, and this is what is the obsession, the true obsession of Roman aesthetics. Romans very much were impressed by realism, as we know from so many different sources. Pliny, of course, the famous contest between the two painters and all of that. They really were interested in that. For them, art was really realism, and I imagine that within this contest, so naturalism, precise way of representing reality, right? So this is also a typical Roman feature, and yet we do have Pompeii and these wonderful imaginative and unrealistic paintings. So,
not only Pompeii, Rome,
yeah,
the Nero house,
yeah,
Domus Aurea.
yeah,
They were everywhere. They were successful. And in the Renaissance again, and in the 19th century again, they were always successful. Grotesque, arabesque, this kind of decoration was very successful. So interesting also how this important authority from the past had to fight with the fact that people liked this.
Yeah, this is very intriguing also from the perspective of the classicism, what is Vitruvius contributing to, and this is maybe this is a reason why Vitruvius wasn't never so particularly popular in the history of architecture, even in cultural history. Vitruvius was, although he wrote this exceptional text, which is really unique in ancient culture, as we know, Vitruvius was never considered an authority or someone particularly interesting. Okay, guys, thank you so much. That was amazing. I don't know if someone else would like to say something to close up, to a final word, whatever you want. Otherwise, okay. So this is not the case. Thank you so much. This was splendid. I'll get in touch with you with an idea, and I'll see you. Well, I don't have the calendar now, but we have a couple of other meetings within the next few weeks. So have a nice day for John, evening for us, and for John and Michael, of course. And I'll see you probably in the next days. Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Also, thank you to the audience. Ciao. Bye.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.